The bullet tore through the stage curtain and sent the crowd into chaos, but Miriam Ashford didn't run. She stood frozen center stage, her hands still clutching the crimson fabric of her costume while men shouted and women screamed around her. The shot hadn't been meant for her, she realized as the drunk gambler was wrestled to the ground by two miners, but the damage was done. Her face, exposed under the harsh glare of the oil lamps, had been seen by everyone in the saloon. 300 pairs of eyes had witnessed the twisted scars that mapped the left side of her face like a topographical chart of her suffering, the ridges and valleys of melted flesh that ran from her temple to her jaw. She fled the stage of the Golden Nugget Saloon in Jamestown, California that April evening in 1878, her career as a singer ending in the same abrupt violence that had marked her skin 5 years before. The fire that had consumed her father's theater in San Francisco had taken everything from her: her parents, her unmarred beauty, and her belief that the world would see beyond the surface. She had survived by hiding, first in hospital wards and charity houses, then behind increasingly elaborate veils that allowed her to move through the world as a ghost of femininity, neither fully seen nor fully invisible. Now, 3 days after that disastrous performance, she sat in the cramped office above the saloon and counted the coins that represented her final wages: $42.30. Enough to buy passage somewhere. But where could a scarred woman go in the West where survival wasn't predicated on either beauty or brute strength? The saloon owner, a portly man named Henderson who smelled perpetually of cigars and whiskey, had been kind enough when he let her go, but his words still stung with their practical cruelty. "The men come here to forget their troubles, Miss Ashford, not to be reminded of them. Your voice is pretty enough, but they need something pretty to look at too." She adjusted the black lace veil that now hung permanently over her face, thick enough to obscure her features while thin enough to see through. It had become her armor and her prison, this delicate barrier between herself and the judgment of others. Through its dark weave, the world appeared softer, less harsh, though she knew the softness was an illusion. The knock on her door came at sunset. She wasn't expecting visitors, had cultivated a careful solitude since arriving in Jamestown 6 months prior. Through the thin wood, a man's voice called out, deep and measured. "Miss Ashford, name's Fletcher Langston. I've got a proposition that might interest you." She opened the door a crack, keeping the chain latched. The man on the other side was tall. She could tell that much even through the narrow opening, with shoulders that filled the door frame. He held his hat in his hands, a sign of respect that surprised her. "I don't know you," she said, her voice muffled slightly by the veil. "No, madam, you don't. But I know you can sing, heard you myself 2 nights before that incident. I'm not here about performing, though. I need help, and I'm willing to pay fairly for it." Something in his tone, earnest without being aggressive, made her unlatch the chain. When she opened the door fully, she could see him clearly in the dying light. He was perhaps 30 years old, with dark hair that needed cutting and eyes the color of creek water after a storm. His face was weathered from sun and wind, marked with the small scars that came from outdoor work, from living rough. He wore dusty range clothes and carried himself with the easy confidence of a man comfortable in his own skin. "What kind of help?" she asked, suspicion warring with desperation in her chest. "I've got a cattle ranch about 15 miles north of here, up in the foothills. Been running it solo since my brother died last winter. I need someone who can keep the books, write correspondence, handle the business side of things. My reading and writing is passable but not good enough for contracts and such. Henderson at the saloon mentioned you kept the books there, said you had fine handwriting and a head for numbers." Henderson told you about me, told me you were looking for work and that you were trustworthy. That's all I needed to hear. Miriam studied him through her veil, trying to read deception in his features and finding none. Men had approached her with propositions before, but those had always carried the weight of ulterior motives. This man, this Fletcher Langston, seemed genuinely focused on business. Why not hire someone from town? Surely there are men more suited to ranch work. I don't need ranch hands. I need someone with skills I don't have. And frankly, most men around here can barely write their own names, let alone manage a ledger. Will you consider it? Room and board included, plus $30 a month. $30 was more than she'd made at the saloon, more than she'd made anywhere since leaving San Francisco. It was enough to save, to perhaps one day have choices again. I would need privacy, she said carefully, my own space. There's a small cabin on the property, used to be where my brother lived. It's got a good stove, solid roof, door that locks. You'd have your privacy, and I'd have my accounts in order. Seems like a fair trade. She should have asked more questions, should have demanded references or time to consider. But the $42 in her pocket was dwindling fast, and the looks she got in town, even veiled, were wearing down her spirit like water on stone. When would you need me to start? Tomorrow, if you're willing. I've got business in town today, but I can bring a wagon around at first light. I don't have many possessions. Then we'll make it an easy move. They agreed on the details quickly, and Fletcher Langston left with a promise to return at dawn. Miriam closed the door and leaned against it, her heart pounding with a mixture of anxiety and something that might have been hope. She had learned not to trust hope, but sometimes it crept in despite her best defenses. That night, she packed her few belongings into a worn carpet bag and a small trunk. 3 dresses, all high-necked and dark, undergarments, the silver-backed brush that had been her mother's, a cameo brooch. The book of poetry she'd read so many times the pages were loose in the binding. Her veils, 5 of them in varying thicknesses. And at the bottom of the trunk, wrapped in cloth, the small mirror she hadn't looked into since the fire. She carried it because it had been a gift from her father, not because she ever wanted to see its reflection again. She slept poorly, dreams full of fire and falling curtains, and woke before the sun. Fletcher Langston was punctual, his wagon rattling into the alley behind the saloon just as golden light touched the tops of the buildings. He loaded her trunk with ease, his movements efficient and respectful. He didn't comment on how little she owned, didn't ask questions about her past. For that alone, she felt a stirring of gratitude. The ride north took them out of the mining chaos of Jamestown and into the rolling foothills of the Sierra Nevada. The morning air was cool and sharp with the scent of pine and wild grass. Miriam kept her veil in place despite the wind that tugged at it, one hand pressed to her hat to keep it anchored. Fletcher drove the wagon with casual expertise, his attention on the rough road rather than on her. "How long have you had the ranch?" she asked after a long silence, feeling obligated to make some conversation. 10 years come summer. Started with nothing but a land claim and stubbornness. Built it up slow, made mistakes, learned from them. Lost most of my herd to a hard winter 5 years back, but we recovered. My brother came out to help 3 years ago, and we were finally getting somewhere. Then he took pneumonia last December and was gone in a week. I'm sorry for your loss. Appreciate that. Daniel was good people, better than me in most ways. He had the patience for the details I tend to ignore. That's why I need someone like you. You know nothing about me, Mr. Langston. I know Henderson trusts you, and he's a good judge of character when he's sober, which is admittedly rare but still counts for something. And I know you worked steady for 6 months without complaint or trouble. That tells me what I need to know. What if I can't do the work you need? He glanced at her then, and she felt the weight of his gaze even through her veil. Then we'll figure it out as we go. I'm not expecting perfection, Miss Ashford, just honest effort. The ranch appeared as they crested a gentle rise, spreading out in the valley below like something from a painting. It wasn't grand by any measure, but it had a sense of purpose and permanence that appealed to her. A main house built of rough-hewn logs with a stone chimney. A barn and several outbuildings. Corrals that held perhaps 50 head of cattle, their red and white coats bright in the morning sun. And set apart, near a stand of oak trees, a smaller cabin with a covered porch. "That's yours," Fletcher said, nodding toward the cabin. "I cleaned it out best I could, but it might need a woman's touch to make it comfortable." He helped her down from the wagon, his hand firm and warm even through her glove, and carried her trunk to the cabin. Inside, the single room was simple but clean. A narrow bed with a rope frame and a straw mattress. A table and 2 chairs. A potbelly stove with wood stacked neatly beside it. Shelves on one wall. A window that looked out toward the mountains. A washstand with a basin and pitcher. "Privy is about 30 yards that way," Fletcher said, pointing. "You'll take meals at the main house, or I can bring them over if you prefer. There's a creek just beyond those trees for washing. Water's cold but clean." Miriam set down her carpetbag and turned slowly, taking in the space. It was more than she'd had in years. A place that could be hers, at least temporarily. A place where she could close the door and be entirely alone. "It's good," she said quietly. "Thank you. I'll let you settle in. Come to the main house when you're ready, and I'll show you the books and explain what needs doing." He left her then, his boots heavy on the porch steps. Through the window, she watched him walk back to the main house, his stride long and purposeful. Then she turned to her trunk and began the process of making the cabin her own. 2 hours later, with her few dresses hung on pegs and her mother's brush on the washstand, Miriam walked to the main house. She kept her veil in place despite the isolation of the ranch, despite the fact that only Fletcher would see her. The veil had become part of her identity, and she wasn't ready to surrender it even in relative privacy. Fletcher met her at the door and led her to a room that served as both office and storeroom. A desk stood near the window, its surface buried under papers, ledgers, and what appeared to be several years of accumulated correspondence. A map of California hung on one wall, marked with notations in rough handwriting. Crates and barrels filled the corners. "It's a mess," Fletcher admitted, running a hand through his hair in a gesture that seemed habitual. "I kept meaning to organize it, but there's always something more pressing. Cattle don't care if the books balance." Miriam approached the desk and carefully lifted one of the ledgers. The entries were sporadic and barely legible, numbers crammed into columns without clear organization. She opened another and found the same chaos. Yet she could see the bones of a system beneath the disorder, the framework of a business that could be successful if properly managed. "How many head of cattle do you run?" she asked. "Right now about 200 scattered between here and the higher pastures. I sell beef to the mines and the towns, some breeding stock to other ranchers. Also got chickens for eggs, a few pigs. Daniel used to handle selling the excess, but I've been barely keeping up with the basics since he died." "What about hands? Do you employ anyone else?" "Got 2 men who help during roundup and branding, but mostly it's just me. Can't afford full-time help, and I prefer working alone anyway." Miriam set down the ledger and looked at him directly, or as directly as the veil allowed. "This is going to take considerable work to organize properly. It might take weeks just to sort through what's here and create a functional system." "I've got weeks. I've got months if you need them. Like I said, I'm not expecting miracles overnight. I'll need supplies. Proper ledgers, ink, pens, filing boxes. Make a list. I'll get whatever you need on my next trip to town." She nodded, already beginning to formulate a plan of attack. Organization had always come naturally to her, a skill inherited from her mother, who had managed the business side of the theater while her father handled the artistic elements. It felt good to have a purpose again, to see a problem that could be solved through effort and intelligence rather than beauty or charm. "I'll start this afternoon," she said. "May I work in here, or would you prefer I take things to my cabin? Here's better. You'll need the desk and the space." "I'm out most of the day anyway, checking stock and mending fence and such. You'll have quiet to work. Then I'll begin immediately after lunch." "About that," Fletcher said, and for the first time since they'd met, he looked uncomfortable. "I'm not much of a cook. Usually just make coffee and fry whatever's at hand. If you can cook at all, we might work out a trade. You make decent meals and I'll knock $5 off the rent on the cabin." "You weren't charging me rent. You said room and board." "Well, then I'll add $5 to your wages. Point is, we'd both eat better if you've got the skill for it." Miriam almost smiled beneath her veil. "I can cook, Mr. Langston. My mother insisted I learn despite my father's protests that actors' daughters didn't need domestic skills. I'll prepare our meals. Call me Fletcher. Mr. Langston makes me feel like I should be wearing a suit and attending church." "Then you may call me Miriam." "Miriam," he repeated, and something about the way he said her name, careful and respectful, made her aware of how rarely anyone used it anymore. She had been Miss Ashford or Madam or, more often, simply ignored. To be Miriam again felt like reclaiming a small piece of herself. They shared a simple lunch of bread and cheese, eating in comfortable silence at the kitchen table in the main house. Fletcher's home was as practical as the rest of the ranch, furnished with handmade pieces that valued function over beauty, but showed good craftsmanship. Miriam noted the details while they ate: the careful joinery of the chairs, the smooth finish of the table, the way everything was clean if not polished. After the meal, she returned to the office and began her work. She started by sorting the papers into broad categories: bills, receipts, correspondence, contracts. The ledgers she set aside to examine more carefully once she understood the full scope of the business. Hours passed without her noticing, the sun tracking across the floor as she created order from chaos. Fletcher came in once, late in the afternoon, to retrieve something from one of the crates. He moved quietly, clearly trying not to disturb her concentration. When he spoke, his voice was soft. "You don't have to work this late. Sun's getting low." Miriam looked up, surprised to see how the light had changed. Her neck was stiff from bending over papers, and her eyes burned slightly from reading Fletcher's rough handwriting. But she felt satisfied in a way she hadn't in years. "I want to finish sorting before I stop for the day. At least let me light the lamp for you." He did so, adjusting the wick until the flame burned steady and bright. In the lamplight, his profile was strong and unadorned, honest in its weathered lines. He reminded her of the mountains visible through the window, solid and enduring. "Thank you," she said. "No, thank you. Already looks better in here than it has in months." He paused at the door, hat in hand. "I'm heading out to check the north fence before dark. There's stew keeping warm on the stove if you get hungry. Help yourself." Then he was gone, and Miriam was alone with the papers and the soft hiss of the lamp. She worked until the words began to blur, then carefully covered the organized stacks with cloths to protect them from dust. The walk back to her cabin in the twilight was peaceful, the air full of the sounds of cattle lowing and chickens settling for the night. Inside her cabin, she lit her own lamp and prepared for bed. It was only when she was unlacing her boots that she realized she hadn't thought about her scars all afternoon. hadn't felt the familiar weight of shame and self-consciousness. She'd been too focused on the work, too engaged in solving problems. The discovery was both liberating and unsettling. She kept the veil on while she changed into her nightdress, only removing it once the lamp was extinguished and darkness filled the cabin. In the dark, she could almost forget what she looked like, could almost be just Miriam again. Not the scarred woman, not the hidden face, just herself. The days that followed fell into a pattern that was comfortable in its predictability. Miriam rose early and prepared breakfast for herself and Fletcher. Simple fare of eggs and bacon and coffee strong enough to strip paint. They ate together in the main house kitchen, exchanging few words but settling into the kind of companionship that didn't require constant conversation. Fletcher would tell her his plans for the day, and she would outline what she hoped to accomplish with the accounts. Then he would disappear into the ranch work, and she would immerse herself in bringing order to his business. It was harder than she'd anticipated, not because the work was difficult, but because Fletcher's record-keeping had been so haphazard. She found bills that had never been paid, payments that had never been recorded, contracts that had been fulfilled but not filed. Yet slowly, carefully, she built a system that made sense. By the end of the first week, she had organized everything into proper categories, and had begun the painstaking process of reconciling the ledgers. Fletcher's finances were better than the chaos had suggested. He wasn't wealthy, but he was solvent, and with proper management, the ranch could be quite profitable. She presented her findings over dinner on Friday evening, having prepared a beef stew with dumplings that Fletcher ate with obvious appreciation. She'd laid out the relevant ledgers and papers on the cleared kitchen table, her explanations clear and thorough. Fletcher listened intently, asking occasional questions that showed he was more intelligent about his business than his poor record-keeping suggested. When she finished, he sat back and shook his head in what appeared to be amazement. "You did all this in a week, most of it. There's still much to do, but the foundation is solid now. Daniel worked on those books for months and never got them this organized." "Perhaps he had other strengths," Miriam said diplomatically. "He did, but organization wasn't among them." Fletcher was quiet for a moment, then met her eyes, or where he assumed her eyes were behind the veil. "I want you to know I appreciate this, Miriam. You've done more than I had any right to expect. You're paying me fairly. It's my job to do it well. It's more than a job being done well. This is," he gestured at the papers, "this is caring about something. That's different." His words touched something in her chest, some long, dormant part that responded to being seen, to being valued for something beyond her appearance or lack thereof. She had spent so long being invisible that Fletcher's recognition of her work felt almost overwhelming. "I do care," she admitted quietly. "It's good to have purpose again." "What did you do before? Before the singing, I mean." The question was gentle but still felt invasive. Miriam's instinct was to deflect, to maintain the walls she'd built around her past. But something about Fletcher's genuine interest, his lack of judgment, made her want to answer honestly. "I grew up in a theater. My parents owned the Ashford Opera House in San Francisco. I helped manage it from the time I was old enough to count money. So this kind of work is familiar. Yes. Though my father's accounts were never quite this challenging," she added with a hint of humor. Fletcher laughed, a warm sound that filled the kitchen. "I'll take that as a compliment to your skills rather than an insult to my record-keeping, though I probably deserve both." The conversation drifted to other topics, safe subjects like the weather and the ranch and the peculiarities of cattle. Miriam found herself relaxing in a way she hadn't since before the fire, her shoulders loosening, her voice growing less guarded. Fletcher had a dry sense of humor that caught her off guard, and more than once she found herself laughing behind her veil. It was only later, back in her cabin preparing for bed, that she realized how dangerous this comfort could be. She couldn't afford to forget what she was, couldn't let herself believe that Fletcher saw past the veil to something worth knowing. Men were kind to useful employees. That was business, not friendship, and certainly not anything more. Yet as she lay in the darkness, she couldn't stop thinking about the way he'd laughed, the way he'd listened to her explanations with real interest, the way he'd said her name like it mattered. The second week brought new challenges. Miriam discovered discrepancies in the accounts that suggested Fletcher had been significantly underpaid for several cattle sales. When she presented her findings, he was more resigned than angry. "Probably right," he said, studying the numbers she'd carefully documented. "Johnson at the mining company has a reputation for fuzzy math. I never had the head to check it properly. These aren't small amounts, Fletcher. You've lost nearly $300 over the past 2 years to these discrepancies." He whistled low. "That's 2 months of running costs." "I could write to him, present the documentation. You might be able to recover some of it. Might also lose future business if he takes offense. Or he might respect that you're running a proper business now and think twice about cheating you again." Fletcher studied her for a long moment, and Miriam felt heat rise in her cheeks beneath the veil, though she wasn't sure why. Finally, he nodded. "Write the letter. Polite but firm. Let's see what happens." She drafted the correspondence that afternoon, taking care to strike the right tone. Professional without being accusatory, detailed without being pedantic. When she showed it to Fletcher that evening, he read it slowly, his lips moving slightly with the words. "This is good," he said when he finished. "Better than good. You've got a way with words that makes it sound like we're doing him a favor by pointing out his mistakes. That was the intent. Men don't respond well to direct accusations, but they can sometimes be guided to correct their errors if approached correctly. You know a lot about how men think." "I grew up watching my mother manage business dealings. She taught me that there are many ways to achieve a goal, and direct confrontation is rarely the most effective." "Your mother sounds like she was a smart woman." "She was brilliant," Miriam said, and was surprised by the strength of emotion in her voice. "She could negotiate with suppliers and smooth over disputes and run the entire theater while making everyone think my father was the one in charge. He was the artist, but she was the foundation." "Sounds like you take after her." "I hope so." Fletcher was quiet for a moment, then asked the question she'd been dreading. "What happened to them? Your parents?" Miriam's hand went instinctively to her veil, pressing the fabric against her cheek. "There was a fire at the theater. 5 years ago, they didn't make it out. And you did." It wasn't a question, but she answered anyway. "Barely." He didn't press for details, didn't ask about her scars or demand to know the full story. Instead, he simply said, "I'm sorry. Losing family is hard no matter how it happens." "Thank you." They sat in silence for a while, not uncomfortable but heavy with shared understanding of loss. When Fletcher finally spoke again, his voice was thoughtful. "Daniel and I lost our parents when we were young. Cholera outbreak when I was 15 and he was 12. We had some family back east, but I was too stubborn to go live with them. Figured I could make my own way. Wasn't easy, but we managed. You raised your brother. More like we raised each other. He kept me from being completely stupid, and I kept us fed and housed. Worked on other people's ranches until I saved enough for the land claim. Daniel stuck with me the whole time, never complained even when things were lean. He was lucky to have you. I was lucky to have him. And I think," Fletcher said carefully, "I'm lucky to have found you too, Miriam. Not just for the work, though that's valuable, but it's good to have someone to talk to again. Someone who understands about loss and still keeps moving forward." His words settled over her like a blanket, warm and unexpected. She wanted to retreat from them, to maintain the safe distance she'd cultivated. But part of her, the part that had been lonely for so long, wanted to accept what he was offering: companionship, understanding, maybe even friendship. "It's good to have purpose again," she said finally. "To feel useful. You're more than useful. You're changing everything here, making it better." She didn't know how to respond to that, so she simply nodded and changed the subject to the next day's tasks. But later, in her cabin, she thought about his words and allowed herself to feel the smallest flicker of something that might have been happiness. The days began to blur together in the best possible way. Miriam established routines and systems, turning Fletcher's chaotic accounts into a model of organization. She wrote letters to suppliers, renegotiated contracts that were unfavorable, and found ways to increase profit margins without sacrificing quality. The response from Johnson at the mining company was grudging but positive. He acknowledged the discrepancies and agreed to a payment plan to rectify them. Fletcher was delighted with that success and began trusting her with more complex decisions. She found herself consulting on which cattle to sell, when to buy feed, whether to invest in new equipment. Her knowledge of business combined with his understanding of ranching created a partnership that was surprisingly effective. But more than the business success, Miriam found herself settling into the rhythms of ranch life. She learned to read the weather by watching Fletcher's face in the morning, learned to tell when the cattle were restless before a storm, learned the difference between the various bird calls that filled the air at dawn. She still wore her veil always, still kept her distance, but the isolation felt less like loneliness and more like chosen solitude. Fletcher remained respectful of her privacy, never pushing her to reveal more than she was comfortable sharing. But they talked more easily now, their conversations ranging from the practical to the philosophical. She discovered he was well-read despite his limited formal education, that he had strong opinions about politics and justice, that he thought deeply about the world beyond the ranch. One evening in her third week, as they sat on the porch of the main house watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and purple, Fletcher asked her about singing. "Do you miss it? Performing, I mean." Miriam considered the question carefully. "I miss the music. I miss the feeling of a song taking shape, of connecting with an audience through melody. But I don't miss the performing itself, the being watched and judged. You were good. The night I heard you before the trouble, you had everyone's attention, until they saw my face." The words came out more bitter than she'd intended. Fletcher was silent for a moment, then spoke carefully. "I didn't see your face that night. The lights were too bright on the stage and I was too far back. I just heard your voice and thought it was the prettiest sound I'd heard in years." "That's kind of you to say. It's not kindness, it's truth. And Miriam," he paused as if weighing his words, "I know you wear that veil for your own reasons and I respect that. But I want you to know that whatever you're hiding, it doesn't change my opinion of you. You're smart and capable and good company. That's what I see." Miriam felt her throat tighten with emotion she couldn't name. "You don't know what you're saying. You haven't seen. Maybe I don't need to see to know what matters." She wanted to argue, to explain that everyone who had seen her face had recoiled or pitied her, that her scars were a barrier no amount of personality could overcome. But something in Fletcher's voice, the absolute certainty of it, made her pause. "Why does it not matter to you?" she asked instead. "Because I've learned that what a person looks like has nothing to do with who they are. I've known beautiful people who were rotten inside and plain people who were worth their weight in gold. And I've learned that the things we hide are usually the things that hurt us most, but they don't define us unless we let them. That's a nice philosophy, but the world doesn't work that way. Maybe not the world, But maybe here on this ranch, things can work differently. Maybe here you don't have to hide if you don't want to. I want to, she said quickly, automatically. Then you should. I'm just saying you don't have to, not on my account. They sat in silence after that, watching the last light fade from the sky. Miriam felt unsettled, her carefully constructed walls shaken by Fletcher's words. He was offering her something she'd never expected: acceptance without demands, respect without conditions. It was terrifying and tempting in equal measure. That night, alone in her cabin, she found herself standing before the wrapped mirror at the bottom of her trunk. Her hand hovered over the cloth, tempted to unwrap it, to confront her reflection for the first time in years. But fear won out, as it always did, and she left the mirror covered. The next morning brought unexpected visitors. Miriam was in the office working on quarterly projections when she heard horses approaching. Through the window, she saw Fletcher walking out to meet 3 men, all mounted and armed. Even from a distance, she could sense tension in the encounter. She moved closer to the window, staying out of sight while trying to hear the conversation. The men were dressed better than typical ranch hands, their guns worn with the casual ease of those who used them regularly. The one in front, a man with silver-streaked dark hair and a thick mustache, was doing most of the talking. Fletcher's posture was rigid, his shoulders squared in a way Miriam had learned meant he was controlling his temper. After several minutes of conversation, the men rode off, but not before the leader looked back toward the house with an expression that made Miriam's stomach clench with anxiety. Fletcher came inside a few minutes later, his face dark with anger. "Trouble?" Miriam asked. "Maybe." That was Vance Richards and some of his men from the Double R Ranch. "He's been trying to buy me out for 2 years, won't take no for an answer." "Why does he want your land so badly?" "I've got water rights he needs for his northern range. Without access to my creek, he has to drive his cattle an extra day to reach good grazing. He's offered what he considers a fair price, but this ranch is mine. I built it, and I'm not selling." "What did he say today?" Fletcher's jaw tightened. "That he's heard I've hired help, that I must be doing better financially. He offered more money and suggested strongly that I take it before circumstances change." "That sounds like a threat." "It is a threat. Richards doesn't make suggestions, he makes demands and backs them up. He's got money and connections, and he's not shy about using both." Miriam felt a chill despite the warm morning. "What will you do?" "Same thing I've been doing. Keep running my ranch and ignore him. He's tried intimidation before, and it hasn't worked. He's a bully, but he's not stupid enough to do anything too obvious." "Are you sure about that?" Fletcher met her eyes, or where he assumed they were behind the veil, and his expression softened slightly. "I'm not going to let him scare me off my own land, Miriam. And I won't let him threaten anyone working for me either. You're safe here. I'm not worried about myself." "Then don't worry about me either. I can handle Vance Richards." But Miriam did worry. Over the next few days, she found herself watching the approaches to the ranch more carefully, startling at unexpected sounds. Fletcher seemed unconcerned, going about his work with the same steady focus, but she noticed he kept his rifle closer than usual. The tension broke unexpectedly a week later when Miriam was hanging laundry behind her cabin. She heard cattle bellowing in distress and ran toward the sound, her veil flying behind her in the wind. Near the main corral, she found Fletcher trying to control his horse while cattle scattered in panic. 3 of Richard's men were on the far side of the fence, deliberately driving the herd against the barriers. Without thinking, Miriam grabbed a bucket and began banging it with a wooden spoon she'd been using for laundry, creating a racket that startled the cattle away from the fence and toward the open pasture. Fletcher used the distraction to get his horse under control and rode toward the intruders, his voice carrying clearly. "Get off my land." The men laughed but retreated, their job of causing chaos accomplished. Several sections of fence were damaged, and 2 steers had minor injuries from being trampled in the panic. It took Fletcher and Miriam the rest of the afternoon to repair the immediate damage and settle the herd. By sunset, they were both exhausted and covered in dust. Miriam's dress was torn, her hands scratched from handling barbed wire, and she'd lost a button from her collar. Fletcher had a bruise blooming on his jaw where a panicked cow had caught him with her horn. They sat on the porch steps of the main house, too tired to go inside. Fletcher handed her a canteen of cool water from the well, and she drank gratefully, forgetting for a moment to be careful about her veil. The fabric clung to her damp face, and she adjusted it automatically. "Thank you," Fletcher said. "For the bucket. That was quick thinking." "I didn't really think at all, I just reacted." "Well, your reactions are good ones." He took a long drink from the canteen, then wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. "This is going to get worse before it gets better. Richards won't stop with fence damage and stampedes. Will the law help?" "The closest sheriff is 3 days' ride, and he's in Richards' pocket anyway. No, if I want to keep this ranch, I'm going to have to defend it myself." Miriam felt something fierce rise in her chest, an emotion she hadn't felt in years. It took her a moment to recognize it as anger, not the cold self-directed anger she'd carried since the fire, but hot righteous fury at the injustice of a man like Richards trying to steal what Fletcher had built. "Then we'll defend it," she said. Fletcher looked at her, surprise clear on his face. I can shoot. My father taught me when I was young, said every woman should know how to protect herself. I'm out of practice, but I imagine it's like riding a bicycle." "It's like riding a horse," Fletcher corrected with a small smile. "Bicycles aren't much use out here." "But Miriam, I can't ask you to risk yourself for my ranch." "You're not asking. I'm offering. This place has become my home too, and I don't intend to let some bully take it." He studied her for a long moment, and she wished she could read his expression more clearly in the fading light. Finally, he nodded. "All right. Tomorrow I'll see how well you remember your shooting lessons. If you're going to stand with me, I need to know you can handle yourself." The next morning, Fletcher set up targets in the pasture behind the barn, bottles and cans arranged on fence posts at varying distances. He handed Miriam a revolver, showing her how to load it properly and check that the mechanism was sound. "It's a Colt single-action army," he explained. "Standard cavalry issue. Not the lightest gun, but reliable. You'll need to cock the hammer for each shot." Miriam took the weapon, feeling its weight in her hand. It had been nearly a decade since she'd held a gun, but the basic principles came back quickly. Stance, sight, breath, squeeze. She aimed at the nearest bottle and fired. The shot went wide, kicking up dust 2 feet to the left of the target. Fletcher didn't comment, just waited while she adjusted her aim and tried again. The second shot clipped the edge of the bottle but didn't break it. The third shot shattered it cleanly. By the time the cylinder was empty, she'd hit 4 of 6 targets. Fletcher reloaded the gun and handed it back to her. "Again. Don't think about the last shot, just focus on the next one." They spent 2 hours practicing, until Miriam's arms ached and her ears rang despite the cloth she'd wrapped around her head for protection. But by the end of the session, she was hitting 8 of 10 targets consistently, and Fletcher looked satisfied. "You weren't lying about your father's lessons," he said, taking the gun and cleaning it with practiced efficiency. "With more practice, you'd be better than half the men I've met. Will it be enough? Enough to defend yourself if it comes to that? I hope it won't." But they both knew it would. Richards wasn't the type to give up after one failed attempt at intimidation. They prepared as best they could, securing the buildings, moving the most valuable livestock closer to the house, establishing sight lines and defensive positions. Miriam continued her work on the accounts during the day, but her mind was often on the approaches to the ranch, waiting for the next trouble. It came 3 nights later. Miriam woke to the smell of smoke and the sound of Fletcher shouting. She grabbed her robe and ran outside to see flames consuming the barn. Fletcher was already there with buckets, trying desperately to control the blaze. Miriam ran to help, joining the bucket chain from the well to the barn. The fire was too advanced to save the structure, but they managed to prevent it from spreading to the other buildings. By dawn, the barn was a smoking ruin, and they were both blackened with soot and exhausted. Miriam stood staring at the destroyed building, and something inside her broke. The smell of smoke brought back memories of the theater fire, of flames and screaming and pain. She felt herself starting to shake, to spiral into panic. Fletcher's hand on her shoulder brought her back. "Miriam, look at me." She forced herself to focus on his face, on the concern in his eyes. "You're safe. The fire's out. We're both safe. He did this. Richards did this. I know. And we're going to prove it and make sure he pays for it. But right now, we need to make sure there's no rekindling, and then we need to rest." They worked through the morning, ensuring the fire was completely extinguished and assessing the damage. The barn was a total loss, along with most of the winter feed stored inside. It was a significant financial blow, one that would be difficult to recover from. That afternoon, as they sat at the kitchen table trying to calculate the cost of rebuilding, Miriam made a decision. "I want to see the sheriff." Fletcher shook his head. "I told you he won't help. Then I'll go over his head. There must be a federal marshal or territorial authority, someone who isn't bought by Richards. The nearest federal marshal is in Sacramento. That's a week's travel at least. Then I'll travel for a week. Fletcher, this has to stop. Richards tried to kill you last night. The fire could have spread to the house, to my cabin. He's escalated beyond property damage. All the more reason for you to stay here where I can protect you." Miriam stood, her hands flat on the table. "I don't need protection, I need justice, and I can get it if you'll let me try." They argued about it for the rest of the day, Fletcher insisting it was too dangerous, Miriam refusing to back down. Finally, exhausted and hoarse, Fletcher gave in. "Fine, we'll both go. I'm not letting you ride to Sacramento alone, and that's not negotiable. The ranch needs someone here. The ranch is already damaged. Richards won't strike again immediately. He'll wait to see if this was enough to break me. We have time." They left 2 days later, taking the wagon and enough supplies for 2 weeks of travel. Fletcher arranged for one of his occasional hands to check on the livestock daily. Though Miriam suspected the real reason for the man's presence was to prevent Richards from completely destroying the place in their absence. The journey to Sacramento was long and often uncomfortable. They traveled through foothills and valleys, sleeping in the wagon or under the stars when no towns were available. Miriam kept her veil in place, though the dust and wind made it nearly unbearable at times. But despite the hardship, she found herself enjoying the journey. Away from the ranch and its responsibilities, Fletcher was more relaxed, more willing to share stories about his past and his dreams for the future. They talked about books and philosophy, about the changing West and what progress meant for people like them. One night, camped beside a creek, Fletcher built a fire and made coffee while Miriam prepared a simple meal of beans and cornbread. They ate in comfortable silence, listening to the water and the night birds. "Can I ask you something?" Fletcher said eventually. "You can ask. I may not answer." "Fair enough." He poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks dancing into the darkness. "Why do you always wear the veil? I mean, I know you have your reasons, but is it because of what other people think or because of what you think?" Miriam was quiet for a long time. It was the most direct question he'd ever asked about her appearance, and she could have deflected it. But something about the night, the isolation and the growing trust between them made her want to answer honestly. "Both," she said finally. "People react badly to disfigurement. They stare, or they look away too quickly, or they show pity that's worse than disgust. The veil saves me from seeing those reactions. And for yourself, I don't want to see what I've become. I remember what I looked like before, and I'd rather keep that memory than confront the reality." Fletcher was quiet, absorbing her words. Then he said, "I understand that, but I think you're wrong about one thing." "What's that?" "You haven't become anything. You're still the same person you were before the fire, just with different scars. We all carry marks from living, some just happen to be visible. That's easy to say when your scars don't make children cry and grown men flinch. Is it? Because I've got scars too, Miriam. They're just not on my face." He stood and turned his back to her, then pulled off his shirt. In the firelight, Miriam could see his back was crisscrossed with thick scars, some old and faded, others more recent. They looked like whip marks, dozens of them, layered and overlapping. "My father wasn't a good man," Fletcher said quietly, putting his shirt back on and turning to face her. "He drank, and when he drank, he got mean. I took a lot of beatings protecting Daniel from the worst of it. These scars are a map of every time I failed to be fast enough or smart enough to avoid his temper. Fletcher, I'm so sorry. Don't be. They're just scars. They hurt when I got them, but they don't hurt now. And they remind me of something important. I survived. I survived him. I survived poverty. I survived every hard thing the West threw at me. These marks prove I'm strong, not weak." He sat back down, his eyes intense in the firelight. "Your scars are the same, Miriam. They're proof you survived a fire that killed others. They're proof you're strong enough to keep living when it would have been easier to give up. That's not something to hide. That's something to be proud of." Miriam felt tears on her cheeks beneath the veil, hot and unexpected. No one had ever spoken to her this way, had ever suggested that her scars could be anything other than a tragedy to be concealed. "You say that because you haven't seen them," she whispered. "Then show me." The words hung in the air between them. Miriam's hand went to her veil, trembling. Every instinct screamed at her to refuse, to maintain the barrier that protected her. But another part, the part that had been slowly growing stronger during her time on the ranch, wanted to trust Fletcher's words. Wanted to believe that someone could see her fully and not turn away. Slowly, carefully, she reached up and removed her veil. The fire cast uneven light across her face, illuminating the scars that twisted the left side from temple to jaw. The skin was smooth but discolored, ridged in places where it had healed poorly, pulling her eyes slightly downward and distorting her mouth. It was the face that had haunted her dreams and driven her into hiding, the face she'd convinced herself was too terrible to be seen. Fletcher looked at her steadily, his expression neutral. He didn't flinch, didn't look away. After a long moment, he spoke. "You have kind eyes. I always wondered what color they were, but I couldn't tell through the veil. They're brown with green flecks. Pretty." "Don't," Miriam said, starting to reach for the veil. "Don't what? Tell you what I see." He leaned forward slightly. "I see a woman who survived something terrible. I see someone who's been working herself to exhaustion to help a stranger with his failing business. I see the person who stood beside me when a bully tried to steal my ranch, who spent hours putting out a fire even though fires must terrify you. I see strength and intelligence and courage. The scars are there, yes, but they're just part of the picture, not the whole thing. You're being kind." "I'm being honest. Miriam, I meant what I said before. I see you clearly, veil or no veil. And what I see is someone worth knowing, someone worth trusting, someone worth—" he paused, as if weighing whether to continue, "someone worth caring about." Miriam couldn't speak past the lump in her throat. She'd prepared herself for pity or disgust, but Fletcher's calm acceptance was harder to process. He looked at her the same way he had when she was veiled, with respect and growing affection. "I should put this back on," she said, holding up the veil, "if it makes you more comfortable. But not on my account, not anymore." She did replace the veil, but more out of habit than fear. Something had shifted between them in those moments of revelation, some barrier had fallen. She wasn't sure what it meant or where it would lead, but for the first time in 5 years, she felt seen as a whole person, not just a collection of scars to be hidden. They reached Sacramento 4 days later, dusty and road-weary. The city was larger than Jamestown, bustling with commerce and politics. It took them half a day to locate the federal marshal's office and another hour to convince the clerk that they needed to speak with Marshal Harrison directly. When they finally gained an audience, Miriam presented their case with the clarity and thoroughness she'd honed managing Fletcher's accounts. She laid out Richard's pattern of harassment, the escalating violence, and the local sheriff's unwillingness to intervene. She produced documentation of the financial losses, witness statements from Fletcher's hired hand, and a detailed timeline of events. Marshal Harrison, a grizzled man in his 50s with sharp eyes and an air of competence, listened carefully. When Miriam finished, he sat back and stroked his beard thoughtfully. "Vance Richards has been a thorn in our side for years. We know he's corrupt, but he's careful. He covers his tracks and has enough legitimate business to hide behind. What you're describing fits his pattern, but proving it in court would be difficult." "What if you caught him in the act?" Miriam asked. "That would be different, but he's not likely to incriminate himself with a federal marshal watching." "He might if he thinks the marshal isn't watching. If he thinks Fletcher is alone and vulnerable." Fletcher understood immediately where she was going. "You want to use me as bait. I want to use the ranch as bait. If Richards thinks we've abandoned it, that we've given up and fled, he might move in openly to claim it. And if Marshal Harrison happens to be waiting nearby, that's a considerable risk," the marshal said. "Richards is known to be violent when he thinks he can get away with it." "The risk is already considerable," Miriam countered. "Right now we're slowly losing everything. At least this way, we might end the threat permanently." They debated the details for another hour, but eventually Marshal Harrison agreed to the plan. He would deputize 2 men he trusted and position them near the ranch, hidden but ready to intervene if Richards made an overt move. Fletcher and Miriam would return and make a show of continuing to struggle with the fire damage, appearing weak and defeated. The return journey was tense, both of them aware of what they were riding toward. But there was also a new solidarity between them, strengthened by their shared purpose and the vulnerability they'd shown each other by the creek. On the 3rd night, camped under a sky so clear the stars seemed close enough to touch, Fletcher spoke the words that Miriam had been half expecting, half dreading. "I've grown to care for you, Miriam. More than I probably should, given that you work for me and this isn't the time or place for such declarations. But I think you should know." Miriam's heart hammered in her chest. "Fletcher, you don't have to say anything. I just wanted you to know that when this is over, when Richards is dealt with and the ranch is secure, I'd like to court you properly, if you'd be willing." She thought about all the reasons she should refuse. She was scarred, damaged, not the kind of woman a man like Fletcher should want. She was his employee, dependent on him for her livelihood. She'd sworn never to let herself be vulnerable to rejection again. But she also thought about how he'd looked at her by the firelight, seeing everything and not turning away. She thought about the way they worked together, the easy companionship, the shared laughter. She thought about how, for the first time in years, she felt like a whole person rather than a broken one. "I'd like that," she said quietly. "When this is over, I'd very much like that." Fletcher's smile was visible even in the starlight, wide and genuine. He didn't push for more, didn't try to kiss her or make grand romantic gestures. He simply nodded and said, "Good. That's real good, Miriam." They arrived back at the ranch to find it undisturbed but clearly watched. Fletcher's hired hand reported that Richard's men had been riding the property lines daily, counting cattle and assessing damage. It was clear they were waiting for something, probably for Fletcher to give up and leave. Marshal Harrison and his deputies arrived the next day, positioning themselves in the hills overlooking the ranch with clear sightlines to all the buildings. The plan was simple. Fletcher and Miriam would go about their business openly during the day, appearing to struggle with repairs and normal ranch work. At night, they would retreat to the main house, which had been reinforced as best they could manage. And they would wait. The wait lasted for days. 4 days of tension, of starting at every sound, of pretending normalcy while knowing armed men watched from multiple directions. Miriam continued working on the accounts. Fletcher worked on rebuilding the barn with green lumber that wouldn't last through winter. To any observer, they looked like people going through the motions, defeated but stubborn. On the 4th night, Richards made his move. Miriam was in the kitchen cleaning up from dinner when she heard horses approaching fast. Through the window, she saw at least 8 riders, all armed, all heading directly for the house. Fletcher grabbed his rifle from beside the door and positioned himself at the window. "Stay down," he ordered, and Miriam obeyed, crouching below the windowsill but keeping close enough to pass him ammunition if needed. The riders surrounded the house, and Vance Richards' voice called out, loud and confident. "Langston, come out and let's talk like reasonable men." "I've got nothing to say to you, Richards. Get off my land, your land. You haven't paid taxes in 3 months. This land is about to go up for auction and I intend to buy it. You're done, Langston. Time to face facts and move on." "I paid my taxes in full," Fletcher shouted back. "Got the receipt to prove it." "Funny thing about receipts, they can be lost. Or maybe that sheriff you paid them to never actually filed the paperwork. Terrible when government officials are careless like that." Miriam felt rage burn through her fear. Richards hadn't just harassed them, he'd corrupted the system to try to steal the ranch legally. But he'd made a mistake in announcing it so openly in front of witnesses. "You're admitting to fraud," Fletcher said. "That's a federal crime. Who's going to prove it? You. You'll be lucky to leave here alive, much less with enough evidence to bother a federal court." That was when Marshal Harrison and his deputies rode out of the darkness, guns drawn and badges visible even in the dim light. "I'll prove it," Harrison said. "Vance Richards, you're under arrest for fraud, arson, destruction of property, and conspiracy to commit murder." The next few minutes were chaos. Some of Richards' men surrendered immediately, smart enough to know when they were caught. Others tried to run and were chased down by the deputies. Richards himself went for his gun, and only Fletcher's warning shot into the air stopped him from drawing. "Don't be stupid, Vance," Fletcher called. "It's over." Richards looked around at his captured men, at the federal lawmen, at the ranch he'd tried so hard to steal. His face twisted with fury, but he raised his hands in surrender. The arrests took hours to process, statements recorded and evidence collected. Marshal Harrison assured Fletcher and Miriam that Richards would face trial, that the corrupted sheriff would be investigated, and that their property rights would be restored and protected. "You did good work here," Harrison told Miriam as he prepared to leave with his prisoners. That timeline and documentation you prepared made this case airtight. Richards will spend years in federal prison, and his ranch will likely be seized to pay restitution to his victims. Will Fletcher be compensated for his losses? He'll get every penny back and then some. You have my word on that. After the marshal and his prisoners departed, taking with them the threat that had loomed over the ranch for so long, Fletcher and Miriam stood on the porch and watched the sun rise. They were exhausted, running on nerves and coffee, but there was also a profound sense of relief. "It's really over," Miriam said. "The trouble with Richards is over, but there's still a ranch to run, a barn to rebuild, accounts to manage, and a life to live. A good life, I hope." Fletcher turned to face her, his expression serious. "Miriam, I meant what I said on the trail. I want to court you properly, but first I need to know something. Do you think you could be happy here? Long term, I mean. Not just as an employee, but as," he paused, gathering courage, "as my wife eventually if things work out between us." Miriam felt her breath catch. She'd known this question was coming, had been preparing herself for it, but hearing it spoken aloud still sent her heart racing. She thought about all the reasons she should be cautious, all the ways she'd protected herself in the past. But she also thought about how Fletcher had seen her scars and hadn't turned away, how he'd trusted her with his ranch and his safety, how he'd listened to her ideas and valued her contributions. "I can be happy here," she said. "I already am happy here, happier than I've been in years. And yes, Fletcher, I'd like to see where this leads. I'd like very much to be courted by you." His smile was like sunrise, bright and warm. "Then I'm going to do this properly. No rushing, no assumptions, just getting to know each other as more than employer and employee." True to his word, Fletcher courted Miriam with old-fashioned care. He brought her wildflowers from the high meadows. He taught her to ride his gentlest horse, spending patient hours in the corral until she felt confident in the saddle. He read to her in the evenings from his small collection of books, his voice stumbling occasionally over difficult words but always earnest. Miriam, for her part, found herself opening up in ways she'd never expected. She told him about her childhood in the theater, about her parents' love story, about her dreams of performing that had died in the fire. She even, gradually, began appearing without her veil when they were alone on the ranch. The first time she came to breakfast unveiled, Fletcher's only comment was, "Good morning, Miriam. Coffee's ready." His lack of reaction was somehow more meaningful than any praise could have been. He'd already seen her, already accepted her. The veil had become unnecessary between them. The ranch thrived under their combined management. The insurance settlement from Richard's conviction paid for a new barn, better than the old one. Miriam's bookkeeping and business sense helped Fletcher expand his operations carefully, adding new revenue streams without overextending. By fall, the ranch was more profitable than it had ever been. But more than the business success, Miriam found joy in the simple rhythms of their life together. She loved the way Fletcher sang while he worked, off-key but enthusiastic. She loved his dry humor and his thoughtful silences. She loved how he listened to her opinions and implemented her suggestions without making her feel like she had to fight to be heard. And Fletcher, watching Miriam bloom from the hidden, frightened woman who'd arrived months before into someone confident and content, felt his affection deepen into something profound. He loved her intelligence and her courage. He loved how she hummed while cooking and how she got completely absorbed in bookkeeping until he had to physically pull her away for meals. He loved that she'd stood beside him against Richards, that she'd been willing to risk everything to protect what they'd built together. By Christmas, it was clear to both of them where this was heading. On Christmas Eve, with the house decorated with pine boughs and the smell of Miriam's cooking filling the air, Fletcher asked her to come outside with him. In the yard, under a sky brilliant with stars, he took her hand and spoke the words he'd been rehearsing for weeks. "Miriam Ashford, I'm not a man of fancy words or grand gestures. I'm just a rancher trying to build something lasting in a hard land. But I love you, truly and completely. I love your strength and your kindness and the way you see solutions where I only see problems. I love how you've made this ranch a home, made my life fuller and better in every way. Will you marry me?" Miriam looked at him, this good man who'd seen past her scars to the person beneath, who trusted her and valued her and loved her. Tears streamed down her face, both the scarred side and the unmarred, and she didn't care who saw them. "Yes," she said. "Yes, Fletcher, I'll marry you." He kissed her then, gentle and sweet, his hands cradling her face like she was something precious. When they finally pulled apart, both laughing and crying, he produced a simple gold band from his pocket. "It was my mother's. Daniel saved it for me, told me to give it to someone worthy." "You're more than worthy, Miriam. You're everything." The ring fit perfectly, sliding onto her finger like it had been made for her. They stood in the starlight, holding each other, and Miriam felt something she'd thought lost forever. A sense of belonging, of being chosen, of being loved exactly as she was. They married in January of 1879, in a simple ceremony at the ranch attended by Marshal Harrison, Fletcher's hired hands, and a few neighbors who'd become friends. Miriam wore a dress of deep blue silk, her face unveiled for all to see. There were some stares, some whispers, but Fletcher's proud stance beside her and his obvious devotion made it clear that he saw nothing but beauty. The reverend who performed the ceremony was a traveling minister, used to the rough edges of frontier life. He didn't comment on Miriam's appearance, focusing instead on the love clearly visible between bride and groom. When he pronounced them husband and wife, Fletcher's kiss was thorough enough to make the small congregation laugh and applaud. The first year of marriage was an adjustment, learning to share space and decisions and life in a more intimate way. But Miriam and Fletcher approached it with the same partnership that had served them well in business. They talked through disagreements, compromised on differences, and built a life that honored both of their needs. Miriam continued managing the ranch's accounts, her business acumen growing stronger as she took on more complex dealings. Fletcher handled the physical work of ranching, though he increasingly relied on hired help as the operation expanded. Together, they turned Fletcher's struggling ranch into one of the most successful in the county. But beyond the business success, they found happiness in small moments. Mornings drinking coffee on the porch, evenings reading by the fire, rides through the mountains to check on cattle, turning into opportunities to explore and dream. They talked about everything and nothing, building the kind of deep friendship that made their romantic love even stronger. 2 years into their marriage, Miriam discovered she was pregnant. The news filled her with equal parts joy and terror. Her scarring extended to her neck and shoulder, and she'd worried that the fire might have damaged her ability to bear children. But the doctor in Jamestown assured her she was healthy and that the pregnancy appeared normal. Fletcher's excitement was boundless and endearing. He built a cradle from oak, sanding it until it was smooth as glass. He read books on child rearing, stumbling over medical terms and asking Miriam to explain things. He worried constantly about her health, to the point where she had to remind him she was pregnant, not dying. "I just want you both safe," he'd say, his hand on her growing belly. "You're my whole world, Miriam." Their son was born in March of 1881, a healthy baby with his father's dark hair and his mother's determined chin. They named him Daniel, after Fletcher's brother, and watching Fletcher hold his son for the first time made Miriam fall in love with her husband all over again. Motherhood came naturally to Miriam, though she'd feared it wouldn't. Daniel was an easy baby, content to be held while she worked on accounts, happy to lie in his cradle near her desk. As he grew, he showed his mother's intelligence and his father's steady temperament, becoming the kind of child who observed carefully before acting. When Daniel was 2, they had a daughter. Sarah arrived during a summer thunderstorm, announcing her presence with lusty cries that made the doctor laugh. She was smaller than her brother had been, with reddish blonde hair that neither parent could account for, until Fletcher remembered his grandmother had been Irish. Sarah was different from Daniel in every way. Impulsive where he was cautious, loud where he was quiet, constantly in motion where he was content to sit and think. She kept Miriam and Fletcher on their toes, finding trouble with unerring accuracy. But she also filled their home with laughter and energy, her joy in life infectious. The children accepted their mother's scars without question. To them, it was simply what Mama looked like, no different from Papa's height or their own features. When Daniel was 4, he asked about it once, tracing the ridged skin with a careful finger. "Did it hurt, Mama?" "Once, a long time ago," Miriam answered honestly, "but not anymore." "Good," Daniel said, and kissed her scarred cheek before running off to play. It was moments like that, simple and profound, that healed something deep in Miriam's spirit. Her children loved her unconditionally, seeing her as whole and beautiful because that was all they'd ever known her to be. And Fletcher, watching her with their children, felt his love for her grow deeper every day. As the years passed, the ranch continued to prosper. They added more land, purchased carefully when neighboring homesteads failed. They diversified beyond cattle, adding horses for breeding and sale. Miriam's business management and Fletcher's ranching expertise made them a formidable team, respected throughout the county. But they never forgot the lessons of those early days, the importance of integrity and community. They paid their hands fairly, treated their neighbors with respect, and contributed to the town's development. When Jamestown needed a new school, Fletcher donated lumber and labor. When a family lost everything in a fire, Miriam organized a collection that provided them with a fresh start. By the time Daniel was 10 and Sarah 8, the ranch had grown to over 3,000 acres and was one of the most successful operations in California. But Fletcher and Miriam lived simply, investing profits back into the business and saving for their children's futures. They'd both known poverty and struggle, and those experiences had taught them the value of security. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Fletcher took Miriam on a trip to San Francisco, their first significant time away from the ranch and children. Daniel and Sarah stayed with neighbors, thrilled by the adventure, while their parents boarded the train west. Miriam hadn't been to San Francisco since fleeing after the fire 15 years before. She'd been nervous about returning, worried that the memories would be overwhelming. But walking the familiar streets with Fletcher beside her, she found more nostalgia than pain. They visited the site where the Ashford Opera House had stood. A new building occupied the space now, a bank with marble columns and brass fixtures. Miriam stood before it, Fletcher's hand warm in hers, and said goodbye to that part of her past. "They would have been proud of you," Fletcher said quietly. "Your parents. Look what you've built, what you've become." "Look what we've built," Miriam corrected. "I couldn't have done any of it without you. We were always better together." That night, in a hotel overlooking the bay, Fletcher gave her a gift. It was a small painting, commissioned from a local artist, showing the ranch in spring. The main house and barn, the mountains in the background, and in the foreground 4 figures. Fletcher and Miriam, Daniel and Sarah, captured in a moment of domestic happiness. "So we never forget," Fletcher said. "So we always remember what matters most," Miriam cried, holding the painting to her chest. It was the first portrait she'd allowed to be made since the fire, and seeing herself rendered in oil paint, scars and all, with her family around her and love evident in every brushstroke, felt like reclaiming something she'd thought lost forever. They returned to the ranch renewed, ready to face whatever challenges the future held. And there were challenges, as there always are: droughts and floods, market fluctuations and difficult cattle. But Miriam and Fletcher faced them together, their partnership only growing stronger with time. Daniel grew into a thoughtful young man who loved the ranch and planned to take it over someday. Sarah discovered a passion for horses and developed a breeding program that produced some of the finest stock in the state. Both children grew up knowing they were loved, knowing their parents' story of how love could grow from adversity. On quiet evenings, when the children were grown and the ranch ran smoothly under their capable management, Miriam and Fletcher would sit on the porch they'd sat on that first day after Richard's arrest. The view had changed some: more buildings, more corrals, more signs of prosperity. But the mountains were the same, and their love had only deepened with time. "You ever regret it?" Fletcher asked one such evening, his hand finding hers with the ease of long practice. "Staying here, marrying me, building this life?" Miriam looked at him, this man who'd seen past her veil when she'd been hiding from the world. His hair was silver now, his face more lined, but his eyes still held the same warmth and integrity that had drawn her to him. "Never," she said firmly. "This is exactly where I'm supposed to be." Even though it was hard sometimes. Especially because it was hard sometimes. "We built something real, Fletcher. Something that matters." He nodded, satisfied, and they sat in companionable silence as the sun set over their land. In the distance, they could see Daniel teaching his young son to ride, the third generation to love this ranch. Sarah was in the barn, working with a pregnant mare, her expertise and passion evident in every movement. "We did all right," Fletcher said eventually. "We did better than all right. We did wonderfully." As full darkness fell and the stars emerged, brilliant and countless, Miriam thought about the journey that had brought her here. From the fire that had nearly destroyed her, through the years of hiding, to that day she'd answered Fletcher's knock on her door in Jamestown. She thought about how close she'd come to refusing his offer, to staying trapped in fear and isolation. But she'd taken a chance, had allowed herself to hope despite all the reasons not to. And Fletcher had proven himself worthy of that hope, had seen her clearly without the veil and loved what he saw. Their story wasn't one of instant transformation or magical healing. It was something better. A story of slow growth, of trust earned over time, of two damaged people choosing each other and building something beautiful from their brokenness. It was a story of courage, both hers in showing her face and his in seeing past it to the person beneath. Years later, when Miriam was an old woman surrounded by grandchildren and great-grandchildren, someone asked her about the veil she'd once worn. By then, her scars had faded with age, though they were still visible, still a part of her face. "I wore it because I thought I needed to hide," she explained. "But then I met someone who taught me that hiding wasn't the same as protecting myself. Fletcher showed me that being seen, truly seen, was worth the risk of rejection. And he was right. Were you ever rejected?" Her granddaughter asked, of course. Not everyone saw what Fletcher saw, but the people who mattered, the people whose opinions were worth considering, they saw me as a whole person. And eventually, I learned to see myself that way too. Fletcher, sitting beside her as he had for nearly 50 years, squeezed her hand. Best day of my life was when you took off that veil by the campfire, not because of what you looked like, but because of what it meant. You trusted me enough to be vulnerable, and I got to prove I was worthy of that trust. We proved it to each other, Miriam corrected gently. Every day, in 1,000 small ways. Their story became part of family legend, told and retold to subsequent generations. The tale of the scarred woman and the cowboy who saw her clearly without the veil, who built a life together on integrity and love, who proved that acceptance and understanding were more powerful than any physical beauty. The ranch continued through the generations, each inheritor adding to the legacy Fletcher and Miriam had established. But more than land or cattle or success, what they passed down was a belief in looking beyond surfaces, in valuing character over appearance, in choosing love even when it requires courage. Miriam lived to see her great-grandchildren grow, to watch the ranch she'd helped build thrive into the 20th century. Fletcher was beside her through all of it, his love constant as the mountains, his respect for her unwavering. They died within months of each other, both in their 80s, having lived lives full of purpose and love. At Miriam's funeral, Daniel spoke about his mother's courage and business acumen. Sarah talked about her kindness and strength. But it was Fletcher's words, spoken at his own fading, that captured the essence of their story. "She was the most beautiful woman I ever knew," he said. Not despite her scars, but including them. They were part of her story, part of what made her who she was. And who she was extraordinary. The ranch stands still, generations later, a testament to what two people can build when they see each other clearly. The original cabin where Miriam first stayed has been preserved, along with the main house and the barn Fletcher rebuilt after the fire. Visitors come sometimes, drawn by the history, by the story of the Langston Ranch and its founders. And in the small family cemetery on the hill overlooking the valley, two graves rest side by side. The headstones are simple, bearing names and dates, and a single inscription that Miriam herself had chosen years before her death. Here lies Miriam Langston, beloved wife and mother. She was seen clearly and loved completely. And beside it, Fletcher Langston, who saw what others missed and loved without condition. Their story, born from adversity and nurtured through challenge, proved that the deepest love often comes not from perfect circumstances, but from choosing to see each other fully, scars and all, and loving what we find. It proved that veils, whether literal or metaphorical, are barriers we construct to protect ourselves, but that true connection requires the courage to remove them. In the end, Miriam's veil became not a symbol of shame but a reminder of transformation, of the journey from hiding to being seen, from fear to love, from brokenness to wholeness. And Fletcher's ability to see past that veil, to recognize Miriam's worth before she'd revealed her face, became a model for how love should be: perceptive, patient, and unwavering. Their legacy lived on not just in the prosperous ranch or the descendants who carried their names, but in the example they set. They showed that beauty is found in character, that scars tell stories of survival, and that the truest vision sees with the heart rather than the eyes. They proved that sometimes the best love stories begin not with perfect people meeting under perfect circumstances, but with flawed humans choosing to see each other clearly and love each other completely, exactly as they are. And in that truth, in that simple, profound acceptance, they found not just happiness, but the kind of deep, abiding joy that transforms ordinary lives into extraordinary legacies. Their story became a beacon for anyone who'd ever felt damaged or unlovable, proof that somewhere out there might be someone who sees clearly without the veil, who loves the reality more than any illusion, who chooses the whole person with all their scars and stories and beautiful imperfections. The cattle still graze in those California foothills. The mountains still stand eternal against the sky, and the love story of Miriam and Fletcher Langston continues to inspire, generation after generation, a testament to courage, acceptance, and the transformative power of being truly seen,